I was 86 years old when I decided to enter that church, knowing it would be the last time I'd set foot there. My body no longer responded, cancer had taken everything, and doctors had given me only 48 hours to live. Every step was an unbearable weight, but my soul cried out for a farewell before the altar where I had knelt so many times when I was young. My grandchildren accompanied me, and I saw in their eyes the reflection of desperation. They looked like children again, begging me not to leave them, but inside I had already accepted that death was at the door. People looked at me differently when I entered. Some whispered I was there for my own early funeral. Others cried silently without courage to approach. The air smelled of incense, but to me it was the smell of farewell. I breathed deeply, trying to capture every detail, from the stained glass windows letting in the faint light of dawn to the distant sound of voices praying. There was nothing more medicine could do, and I had chosen to spend my last moments in God's house. The front pew seemed to be waiting for me. I sat down with difficulty, and my trembling hands gripped the worn wood as if it were the last anchor tying me to life. I remembered the doctor's voice from the morning before. He had said coldly that there was nothing to be done, that it was time to prepare the family for my departure. His words echoed like a death sentence. Inside me, however, there was a spark that wouldn't go out. I wanted to believe there was still something greater than human diagnosis, but the weight of pain crushed me. The hymns began to be sung, and I closed my eyes. The congregation's voices rose in cry, but my voice was a thread almost extinguished. I asked God for only one thing, that He not leave my grandchildren alone, that He take me in peace but care for them. I felt a tear roll down, not from fear of death, but from sadness at abandoning those I loved. My soul broke watching the little hands of my grandchildren clutching my skirt, as if they could hold me here longer. Suddenly I noticed silence took over the environment. It was dawn, precisely 4:17, and it seemed time had stopped. Voices ceased and a chill ran down my spine. I opened my eyes and saw fixed stares on me as if something were about to happen. My heart raced and a strange sensation took hold of my chest. It wasn't pain. It was as if an invisible force lifted me from within. My fragile bones trembled, but I felt an unexpected warmth course through my entire body. I looked around and saw my youngest grandson, only 7 years old, crying desperately. He screamed he didn't want to lose his grandmother. His tears seemed to pierce through the church ceiling and reach heaven. In that instant, I felt I was no longer alone. Something greater than me, greater than all diagnoses, was moving. It was as if an invisible presence had descended from above and enveloped my tired body. I closed my eyes again and was certain it wasn't the end. Something extraordinary was about to reveal itself before all who awaited my death. The impossible was in motion. At that moment, I realized I hadn't entered to die, but to witness the greatest mystery of my life. What happened next left everyone speechless, even those who never believed in miracles. When I opened my eyes, I felt something inside me had changed. It wasn't just a sensation, it was as if life had returned to pulse in my veins. The weight crushing my lungs had dissipated, and the constant pain burning my body seemed to have disappeared. Silence still hovered over the church, but it wasn't ordinary silence. It was silence charged with expectation, as if everyone awaited the intervention of a power that surpassed any human logic. I looked around and saw people with hands covering their mouths, eyes wide, tears cascading down. No one understood what was happening, but everyone could feel it. There was an intense light at the altar, not a common light from lamps, but something supernatural descending from above. It enveloped me like a golden mantle, warming every fiber of my tired body. My heart beat strong, as if it were a young woman's heart again. My oldest grandson, only 13 years old, held my arm with such force, he seemed to fear I would vanish before his eyes. But instead of falling, I felt my legs firm. I breathed deeply and realized there was no longer pain. The crowd murmured and someone shouted, "It's a miracle." Those words echoed off the church walls, making everyone stand up. I remember seeing among the crowd the doctor who had accompanied me in recent months. He had been hard on me, always cold, repeating there was no chance of recovery. That night, he was present at a relative's insistence, and when our eyes met, I noticed his disbelief. He shook his head, unable to accept what he witnessed. He approached slowly, like someone refusing to believe what they see. He touched my pulse, placed his hand on my chest, and with a trembling voice murmured, "This isn't possible." The congregation ignited in prayer. Many fell to their knees, others cried aloud. I saw people who had never before knelt at the altar crying out to God with fervor. That environment, which moments before seemed prepared for a goodbye, transformed into a scene of revival. The fire of faith set every heart ablaze. I, who had entered to die, now remained standing, sustained by an inexplicable force. Suddenly, I clearly heard a voice. It didn't come from any human being. It didn't come from the pastor or the people around me. It was a firm, serene, and powerful voice that said, "Your story isn't over yet." Those words penetrated my soul, and I felt as if every cell in my body were renewed. Those nearby claimed to have heard the same voice, and the news spread through the temple. God had spoken. From that instant, the impossible took form before everyone. I moved my arms without pain, walked a few steps alone to the altar, and raised my hands to heaven. My grandchildren's crying transformed into shouts of joy. The pastor, moved, declared aloud he had never witnessed such a manifestation of divine power in his entire life. What should have been a farewell became a testimony that ignited the faith of all present. As I stood before that crowd, I realized death had been defeated. I hadn't just survived, I had been reborn before the eyes of an entire church. What no one expected was that the miracle wouldn't end there. It was just beginning, because something even greater was about to happen before everyone. I believed the miracle was complete, but I barely knew that that same night a new battle would arise, revealing that God's intervention would go even further than anyone could imagine. I believed everything had ended there, before the altar. When I felt my strength return and heaven's voice declare my story hadn't ended yet. But it didn't take long to realize something greater was in motion. While I still raised my hands, I heard a strange noise from outside. Screams mixed with the sound of hurried footsteps. Doors were violently opened, and suddenly, armed men invaded the church. They were known in town as dangerous criminals, men who hated any manifestation of faith. The congregation panicked. Some people threw themselves to the ground, others tried to protect their children. My grandchildren clung to me, trembling with fear. The pastor moved forward to try to dialogue, but was pushed brutally. The scene was total chaos. One of the invaders raised his voice and shouted that this night would be the last time that church would gather. They said the temple would be destroyed, we would all burn together as punishment. In that instant, I felt injustice had risen against us with all its fury. The incredulous doctor who was still beside me turned pale. He repeated this made no sense, that it wasn't enough to defy science. Now we were also persecuted by violence. I saw desperation in his eyes, but inside me something remained firm. I was no longer bent by pain, and an invisible force made me remain standing, even before the threat of death. The bandits lit torches and threw fire against the wooden benches. The smell of smoke began to spread. Children cried, women cried out loudly, and some men tried to contain the flames with their bare hands. The vision of those sacred walls being consumed by fire seemed unbearable. My heart tightened, but at the same time a conviction took hold of me. God hadn't delivered us from death to allow everything to end in destruction. I knelt in the middle of the central aisle, holding my grandchildren's hands. I closed my eyes and cried out, not with the voice of one asking for mercy, but with the voice of one who had already tasted victory over death. I cried to heaven to show his glory once more. The noise was deafening, but suddenly, a strong wind swept through the temple. The flames devouring the benches were extinguished as if someone had blown them out. Silence returned to take over the environment. When I opened my eyes, I saw the bandits paralyzed, their torches fallen to the ground, extinguished by the mysterious wind. They looked up, and then we all saw. A brilliant light, stronger than any fire, descended through the church ceiling and illuminated the entire space. Some armed men fell to their knees, unable to stand. Others dropped their weapons, crying like children. The pastor, still moved, declared we were witnessing divine intervention. The faithful shouted, "Miracle, miracle," and even the doctor, who moments before doubted everything, began to cry and say he could never explain what he was witnessing. I felt my body light, taken by a peace no human threat could shake. But while the congregation celebrated, I noticed one of the invaders remained standing, with eyes full of hatred still holding a weapon. His breathing was heavy and his voice loaded with rancor echoed through the temple. "If fire didn't destroy you, then it will be my shot that silences this faith forever." In that instant, as the weapon was pointed toward the altar, I understood the true miracle was still to happen. What followed was so impactful it would forever change the lives of all who were there. The weapon gleamed under the supernatural light still enveloping the temple. The man remained standing firm in his fury, as if incapable of surrendering to the power that had already bent so many that night. My heart raced, but unlike other times when I feared death, in that instant, there was no fear in me. There was a serene conviction, a certainty that the God who had already raised me before death wouldn't allow his name to be dishonored by that act of violence. The invader raised the pistol and pointed directly at the altar. I could hear my grandchildren's crying, clinging to my skirt, asking that this not happen. The entire congregation was silent, paralyzed between disbelief and dread. The pastor, with tears streaming down his face, raised his hands and cried out loudly for the Lord to intervene once more. The echo of his plea still vibrated on the walls when something surprising happened. The man's finger pressed the trigger, but no shot came out. The metallic sound of failure echoed in the temple. He tried again with more force, and again nothing happened. His face transformed into despair. Angrily, he threw the weapon to the ground and grabbed another attached to his waist. The faithful stood up in panic, but before he could shoot, a ray of light pierced through the church ceiling. It wasn't a common lightning bolt. There were no clouds in the sky. It was a white, intense light that enveloped only the armed man. His eyes widened and his body began to tremble as if unable to bear that presence. He fell to his knees, screaming he couldn't see. His voice, before loaded with hatred, was now a desperate cry. "Something burned my eyes," he said. But everyone knew it wasn't human fire. It was divine fire, the kind that consumes evil without destroying flesh. At that moment, many began to cry with relief and praise. The incredulous doctor who had witnessed my healing ran to the invader and tried to help him, but soon realized it wasn't common blindness. The man was before heavenly judgment, and nothing human hands could do would interfere. The temple transformed into a scene of surrender. People sang, others fell prostrate, and the atmosphere was taken by an irresistible force. I myself felt my legs carry me to the man who had tried to destroy us. When I approached, he cowered like a frightened child. I placed my hand on his head and, with a voice that didn't seem to be just mine, declared that God's forgiveness was greater than his evil. The words came out of me as if blown by the Spirit itself. In that instant, the man began to cry compulsively. His weapon fallen to the ground was now just a piece of useless iron before the invisible power that had defeated him. The fire that before threatened to consume the church no longer existed, and the extinguished torches were reminders of chaos that couldn't prevail. The entire congregation, which had entered despair, was now in ecstasy. The temple seemed to breathe new life, as if it had been rebuilt from within. I, who had arrived to die, now became witness to something even greater. The enemy defeated by divine power before everyone. But while the invader prostrated himself in tears, a strange sensation ran through my body. It was as if that miracle still hadn't been completed. I felt something more was about to happen, something that concerned not just the church, but the entire city that until then mocked faith. At that moment, I understood what we were witnessing wasn't just a miracle for one night, but the beginning of a movement that would change the destiny of an entire city. What happened next left even the most incredulous speechless. When I saw that man fall to his knees crying like a child, I understood it wasn't just my life that had been transformed that night. God was writing a new story before all of us. The invader, who minutes before threatened to destroy the church with fire and blood, now prostrated himself asking forgiveness. His eyes were still blind from the light that had enveloped him, but his heart seemed to have been stripped of all fury. He cried out loudly, asking for mercy, while his hands beat against the temple's wooden floor. The people around began to stand. Some approached him to pray, others just cried, unable to explain what they were witnessing. The smoke from the torches had already dissipated, and the air, before suffocating, was now fresh as a new morning. I felt a gentle breeze sweep through the church, and it brought with it something I can only call heavenly peace. It wasn't natural wind. It was as if the heavens breathed inside that place. I looked at the doctor, who remained motionless, and saw tears descending from his face. He, who had so many times treated me as just a condemned patient, now saw before him a scene impossible to be recorded in reports or exams. He approached me with a trembling voice and said he needed to reevaluate everything he believed about life and about God. I didn't respond with words, just smiled, because I knew that miracle wasn't just for me. It was also to break his disbelief, and that of all who still doubted. The pastor then raised his voice and declared we couldn't keep this just to ourselves. What had happened needed to echo beyond the temple walls. And that's exactly what happened. Someone ran to turn on the external sound system, and the prayer rising inside the church began to echo throughout the city square. People walking at dawn, workers heading to the market, curious ones who believed in nothing, all stopped to listen. In a few minutes, the square was full. Men and women approached, pushing to try to enter the temple. Some shouted they had seen a light descend on the roof. Others claimed to have felt warmth in their hearts, even without being inside. It was as if divine intervention had overflowed from the altar to every corner of that city. I, standing in the central aisle, held my grandchildren's hands and could see their little eyes shining like never before. They, who had prepared to say goodbye to me, now witnessed their grandmother healed and full of life, transformed into witness of a miracle that dragged an entire city to God's feet. But not everyone accepted what they saw. Among the crowd arriving, I heard protest shouts. Some said it was all manipulation, others shouted it was witchcraft. I saw furious men trying to silence the sound, threatening to break the speakers. Injustice still rose against us, even before the impossible. Deep in my heart, I knew we would still face a battle, and that what God had begun that night wouldn't end without resistance. I believed I had seen the peak of the miracle, but that dawn I understood the true confrontation was yet to come. And what happened next was so intense it still echoes in the memory of all who were present. The square was taken by a mixture of faith and revolt. From inside the church, I heard voices exalting God's power clashing against furious screams of those who rejected what had happened. It was as if heaven and hell met before us that dawn. My grandchildren squeezed my hands tightly, and I could feel their hearts beating fast. I, who so many times feared losing my life, now remained firm, knowing I had been raised not just to live, but to testify. Some furious men pushed the church doors, invading the temple with stones in their hands. They said they would silence those voices and end the deception. The doctor, still astonished, tried to contain them but was pushed to the ground. The pastor ran to protect the altar, but soon a chaotic scene formed. I knew if something didn't happen, violence would take over everything. It was at that moment that again an invisible force manifested. The wind that before had extinguished the fire returned, but now it was stronger. The temple candles went out, and everyone was plunged into sudden darkness. The entire square silenced as if even the air had been held. Then, a sound echoed through the space. It wasn't human. It was a powerful and deep voice everyone heard at the same time. "My light cannot be extinguished." Those words echoed inside my chest like thunder, and I saw the men who had entered with stones fall to their knees, their hands trembling, unable to move a single muscle. The stones rolled across the floor as symbols of violence's defeat. My eyes filled with tears, not from fear, but from reverence. I knew we were witnessing something that would forever mark that city's history. Outside, the crowd began to sing spontaneously. There was no rehearsal, no music, but voices arose in unison, as if heaven itself had tuned every heart. The sound spread through the dawn, crossing streets, reaching homes, awakening those who slept. People came out of their doors, some barefoot, still in sleeping clothes, drawn by that heavenly song. Meanwhile, the man who had threatened to kill us still remained kneeling before the altar. His blindness persisted, but his lips repeated a plea for forgiveness. I approached him again and felt the Spirit impelling me to say his life would be spared, but would never be the same again. He cried like a child, and in that crying, I perceived a hardened soul being broken before everyone's eyes. The square, which began as a stage for screams of hatred, was now dominated by praise and tears. I saw women who had never set foot in a church kneel in the middle of the street. I saw men who mocked faith raise their hands to heaven. Injustice had tried to silence our voice but was defeated by a power no human arm could resist. Still, in my heart, I knew the enemy wouldn't give up so easily. That dawn had revealed divine strength, but had also awakened contrary forces that would still try to destroy us. What would come after would be even more decisive, not just for me or for the church, but for the entire city that was now divided between faith and disbelief. I thought the battle had ended, but I was wrong. What happened at the following dawn would bring dark secrets to light and reveal how far God's power would go to protect his people. The sun began to rise and the first golden rays pierced through the church's broken windows. I'll never forget that dawn. It was as if heaven itself had decided to witness what was happening in that small temple which, during the night, had become the center of an entire city. The smoke had disappeared, the fire had been extinguished, but the flame now burning in every heart was impossible to contain. People continued arriving. I saw entire families running through the square, some still with dry tears on their faces, others bringing the sick in improvised chairs, as if they believed the same God who had raised me could also touch them. The atmosphere was indescribable. There was a weight of glory hovering over everyone, something neither words nor songs could explain. The doctor, who until then had remained silent, took courage and spoke before everyone. With a choked voice, he confessed his science couldn't explain what had happened to me, nor the failure of weapons, nor the light that blinded the invader. He said for the first time in his life, he believed there was a power greater than medicines and diagnoses. His words broke the hearts of many who still doubted. The unbeliever had transformed into a witness. It was then a scream from the square caught my attention. A desperate mother brought her daughter in her arms. The girl was unconscious, her body fragile as if life had already escaped. The woman's desperation tore at the soul. She cried out her daughter had stopped breathing during the rush to the temple. Silence took over the environment, and I felt all eyes turned to me. I, an 86-year-old woman who had entered to die, was now called to pray for another's life. My legs trembled, but not from fear. I approached the girl, knelt beside her, and placed my wrinkled hands on her chest. I closed my eyes and cried to heaven with all the faith burning inside me. I asked the God who had raised me to breathe life again into that child. I asked that injustice not have the last word, that mother's suffering be transformed into joy. Suddenly, I felt warmth course through my hands and a gentle breath filled the environment. The girl coughed and opened her eyes. Her chest rose in a deep sigh, and then she clung to her mother's neck. The scream that echoed in the square was deafening. It was the scream of life defeating death once more. People ran to see up close, crying, laughing, applauding. I myself cried like a child. I knew it wasn't me, but the one who had descended upon us that dawn who now continued acting. The man who had tried to kill us still remained on his knees. When he saw the girl return to life, he began to scream he couldn't take it anymore, that he wanted to surrender his soul to the God who had defeated his fury. The congregation surrounded him, and the pastor guided him in prayer. The one who had been enemy became brother before everyone. It was like watching darkness transform into light before my eyes. When the sun was already high, I realized nothing would be as before. That church, before small and forgotten, was now a symbol of hope. I myself, who had entered to die, now walked standing, strong, secure, knowing my testimony would live forever. The impossible had become reality, and the entire city had been marked by divine power. Beloved Lord, I know many listening to this story carry invisible pains, cruel diagnoses, and tears no one sees. Just as that dawn, you transformed my end into a new beginning. I ask you now, visit every tired heart, every home that feels empty, every soul that has lost hope. Wipe the tears of those who cry in silence. Restore the health of those who no longer find a way out. Lift up those who fell under the weight of pain. Show, Father, that death doesn't have the last word, that injustice cannot overcome your justice, that despair isn't greater than your presence. May every person listening to this prayer feel now the same breath of life that filled that church. May they feel peace where there was anguish, hope where there was despair, light where everything seemed darkness. In the name of Jesus, I declare better days, renewed lives, and strengthened hearts. Amen. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any testimony of faith and miracles. Also, leave your comment telling which part spoke to you most, because your story can strengthen other lives. Share this video with someone who needs hope today.